Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this Music and Arts on Wednesdays on Viking.TV. I'm very pleased that Viking have asked me to talk to you today. Viking have been a great partner to our company, Opera Holland Park, for several years now. And we always share the concept, we think, that, culture is not just an add-on to our lives, and it's an integral part of what we do, of course, and it's an integral part of what they do on their ship. So I'm really, really pleased to talk about what I'm here to talk about. And effectively, this week, I'm not really talking about the company. I'm going to do that next week, all things being equal. But this week is really to talk a little bit about me and my life and how I ended up from a very unusual school and background in the world of the classical arts, because that's not really what you would have expected me to do when I was 16 years old, perhaps. So it was a very unusual path, but it really was born, and I write about that in my book, which is essentially about a very unusual school that I attended in the 70s and early 80s, which is no more. And it has a real resonance for today, the school, because our cultural education is weakening quite a lot, particularly in this country. And this particular school was very much about culture and sport, but very much about culture. But I ought to probably start from the beginning, which is where I was born in London. I was born in London, but my parents are Italian. They came from Italy after the war. And Italy, southern Italy, particularly after the war, was a terrible, murderous place. It had cholera and all sorts of diseases and malaria running around the mountains and the villages where my parents were. And in, I think, the early 50s, Britain was very, very eager to draw people over to the UK to work. So they were obviously bringing people in from the colonies or the empire. So you had India and the Caribbean and various places, but they also put the call out to countries in Europe which were really badly affected by the war. So my mum and dad, who came from a village in Italy called Montecorvino, there are two parts. There's Montecorvino Pugliano, which is at the top of the mountain, and Rovella, which is halfway down the mountain. My dad was from Rovella, and he was considered fairly sophisticated compared to my mum's lot, who were at the top of the mountain and was slightly less sophisticated. And as we understand it, there was a bit of an elopement as well, because I don't think there was a huge amount of approval for the marriage. So they came to England in the early 50s and took up jobs as my mum was a cook in large houses, ironically in Holland Park. And there's mum there. And my dad was a butler, which is one of the most preposterous things. Once you ever knew my dad, for him, that's my dad and my grandfather. My dad, of course, after three kids were produced by them both, decided to fly the nest and took up with a lady who were friends of my mum and dad's and who'd come to England and that my mum and dad had been putting up. So he went off and then he came back again. And that's when I was conceived. And once I was 6 months old, and happily on Christmas Day, I should say, he flew the nest again. And that was the point at which mum had enough and never, ever took him back again. But that left mum with 4 young kids between the ages of 0 or 6 months and 6 years old, living in what was essentially a slum. And we lived in a place called Woodstock Grove in Shepherd's Bush, very close to Holland Park. And that's the pub at the end of Woodstock Grove. Now, Woodstock Grove was a dead-end street, and it both socially and literally. And at the end of the street, we had quite exciting, I thought, a film studio that was used by the BBC. And there it is, Woodstock Studios. Now, of course, Woodstock Grove, like a lot of London, is fabulously renovated and gentrified. But when we lived there, it was a real slum is possibly too strong a word, but not that strong. And we lived in, we had an outhouse toilet, we didn't have a bathroom. We had lots, and it was very small and damp. But, you know, it was a basement, and we had a wonderful time, really, as kids. It was a real 60s London community that I think only people who grew up in London in the 60s would understand. But we had all sorts of characters in the street. We had, you know, a bloke with one, Old Man Lacey, he was called. He had one arm, and he used to sell rabbits he used to breed them under his stairs, and another bloke bred chickens, and we could buy eggs from him. And it was just slightly crazy, really. It was a bit like a sort of, if you wrote a film about it, you maybe wouldn't even believe it. The pub at the end of the street was the center of social world, and the women of the street needed just come out onto their doorsteps and call their husbands' names, and they'd come tottering out the pub. And of course, it was an enormously dangerous playground because there were still bomb sites in London, even in the 60s. And we had a big bomb site at the end of our road, which was a huge big dip in the land. And so we'd play there. We had railway lines that ran across the end of our little garden, which was the London Underground. And we used to play games by when a train was stopped at red, we'd all jump on, see who could hold on longest before jumping off again. Now, this was dangerous for more than one reason, which they were electrified lines. I don't remember any kids dying doing that, but that's a surprise. With like huge bonfires for what, I don't know if you're in America, you may not know about Guy Fawkes Night, which was 5th of November, and it was a fireworks and bonfires. And we'd light 3 or 4 huge bonfires along the street, and the tarmac would buckle, and the fire brigade would have to come every year and put out these enormously dangerous fires. So we were rough kids. We lived in the streets, and my mum had to keep 2 jobs, so she wouldn't get home till quite late in the evening. We were very much what you call latchkey kids. But it was a community, and everyone looked out for each other. But, you know, we were all, one of my brothers, Matteo, who you'll hear about, he started to be the one that had the most reckless personality. He would do crazy things like put fireworks in his pocket and light them to see what would happen, and he'd end up in hospital with burns, and he'd jump off walls into plate glass piles and cut his feet. He was always injured. He was always in hospital, and he was getting into lots of trouble. He was, you know, nick a few sweets from the shop. He was proving to be what we used to call, you know, the black sheep of the family, but he wasn't. He was just a crazy, mischievous kid. But I think that, you know, perhaps social services were paying attention, and eventually Mum got a job in a nursery, and she was a cook, and she was, you know, the nursery in Shepherd's Bush for small kids had the best food in West London because they got the whole Italian repertoire served to them when everyone else was getting fish and chips. And then Holy of Holies, we got offered a new flat in Fulham in an estate that had been there since around the 30s, and it was considered quite upmarket, really. It wasn't terribly, but it had an indoor bathroom, and it had 3 bedrooms. We were on a higher floor, and it didn't have mice, which was really nice because I hated mice, and I still do. And so we moved to this place in Fulham Court. I remember the day very distinctly when we went to go and view the flat, and I was so excited that there was a bath there that I had to have a bath while we were doing the viewing. I'd never sat in a bath or even contemplated one. I didn't even know what one was. We used to wash in the sink in the kitchen. So that was a huge uplift in our social circumstances, really, by going to Fulham Court. And I think there may even be a picture of Fulham Court at some point coming up, which we'll show you. But, oh, there it is. There it is. This was, I mean, they're very well built flats, but you can see that it wasn't terribly posh or well developed. I want you to remember this, and we'll probably play this little bit of film again later because I'm going to show you a contrast. But this looks around the late 70s, early mid 70s. So, you know, we'd been there a while. Now, Fulham Court was also a fantastic community. I mean, there were quite a few criminals on the estate, of course, but it was a real fabulous community. And again, all of my memories are just of having wild, exciting games and times playing in the flats, mainly keeping out of trouble, but not always, but nothing terrible. But everything we seemed to do seemed to have a lot of danger attached. I remember climbing across roofs and up and down drain pipes. I mean, it sometimes bewilders me that we survived our childhood sometimes. And that was really between when I was 5, we moved there. And of course, we had an Italian family. Mum and Dad were Italian. Dad wasn't around, but a lot of other Italians, and my uncle, a couple of my uncles had moved to London. So we grew up very much in an Italian sort of community. You know, Sundays were crazy. It was sort of open house, and people would turn up. Sometimes people you didn't even know, but they were friends of mums from back in Italy, and they'd turn up, and there'd be lots of food, and there'd be lots of drink. It was very, very earthy and southern Italian. And of course, we used to go, and this actually was a bit of a luxury, but we used to go on summer holidays to Italy. And back in those days, from London. Now, this is Mum's town. This is a picture that was taken in 1972. It's grown since then, but this is the town essentially as it was. Very, very old, very ancient, some of it. You can't see a lot of the ancient streets that course through the town. It was a fabulously romantic and exciting place to spend our summers with all hundreds of cousins and my mum's family and my dad's family. There's me on the right with the yellow shirt, and my 2 brothers. Matteo is in the middle, and Serge is on the left. With what I know is a really cool T-shirt, Public Enemy #1. I mean, that was way before Public Enemy became a famous group. But so this was Monte Corvino, and so we'd spend our summers here, and we would just run wild, really, through the mountains and catch lizards and play. And it was a great thing to come back to my school in near Holland Park called Addison Gardens and tell all these tales of my exotic family and holidays and summers in Italy. Lots of Italian swear words, of course, would come back with me, and actually dialect Neapolitan, which were even worse swear words. And we'd come back and say how exciting it all was out there. It was very romantic and very mysterious, because none of the kids I grew up with sort of ever went abroad on holiday. And so it was sad. But we had to go by train to Italy, and it took 24 hours. And we'd all be crammed into a little couchette cabin on a train, and we'd go through the Alps overnight. And it was extraordinarily exciting for us as kids. And of course, we had all of our family there, and we'd tell tales about them. And one of my families, my mum's brother, was a guy called Rolando, who all of us worshipped. He was a trapeze artist. There he is there. I mean, how handsome. He could have been a film star, but he was built like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he became a very famous trapeze artist. And he was just fabulous. We loved him. And we would tell stories about him. No kids in West London had an uncle who was a famous trapeze artist. And me being me, of course, it made me special too. And that was one of the great things about going to Italy. And that culture and that background has persistently and consistently really informed my kind of self-impression. And of course, growing up, I would hear Italian music a lot in the house. I mean, as well as the Beatles and everyone else. But mum and dad, well, dad when he was there, but mum, she used to love Neapolitan music, and then we'd have the Mario Lanza records, which would have bits of opera and things. So this was never terribly unfamiliar to me, but it was a very key part of my upbringing, and my cultural identity is still to this day Italian. But we were poor still, and my oldest brother Lou and Matt, my second eldest, went to a local school in Fulham. Lou was very applied. Matt did his best to stay out of school, and it was about this time when he was in his early teens that he started to have breaks at the leisure of Her Majesty, which is essentially means that he would be sent to places called borstalls, which I think in America they call juvie hall or something, but they were kind of prisons for kids. And it was beginning to be a real problem for mum, and mum was really struggling to keep him in check. He'd started to dabble and play in drugs and things, and it was getting really difficult. And I think our schools and social services were paying attention. I never met social workers, but I do remember once when I was burned by some hot tea, and I was taken to hospital. I spent 2 weeks in hospital, and as I was in the room and in A&E, I was visited by a young woman who appeared to know me, but I didn't really know her. And she was crying and upset, and I was a bit annoyed at that. I said, I don't know why you're crying. I'm the one who should be crying. I was really quite badly burned by this hot tea. So years later, you realise that perhaps social services were paying attention. And one day, this proposal was made to my mother that Sergio, who was 2 years older than me, should try to get into a particular school. Now, the school system in London, in England, is very much, you may know, it's state and it's private, but we call our private schools are public schools. This school was owned and run by the London Education Authority, so it was a state school, but it was a grammar school, which is shorthand for selective. So you had to do an exam, an 11 plus, to get in. And this school was a place called Wolverston Hall. And Wolverston was a educational experiment, I suppose you would call it. There was really an argument back in the 50s that you had to have money to have intelligence. And of course, there were people at the time, and politicians, who said, well, that's rubbish. The only difference is poor people are just as intelligent, but they need the opportunities. So they set up this remarkable place, 75 miles away from London. We're going to see pictures of it later. 75 miles away from London, in beautiful grounds, and created a sort of poor man's Eton. And the really distinguishing part, it was a school that was designed to give poor inner city youngsters, boys, it was a boys' school, opportunities that only wealthy kids would normally get. And that was a remarkable ambition. And they peopled this school with some of the most brilliant and fabulously intellectual teachers. And so Serge suddenly disappeared. He went for 6-7 weeks at a time. He was at this school, which was a boarding school. And I would go and visit him there. And I was kind of, not too aware. It was just looked like a really cool place to spend time. And I think Serge was very homesick at first, but it was something I knew was coming my way as well. And eventually, Wolverston appeared on my horizon, and I was completely unfazed by it. I wasn't bothered about leaving home. And I thought, yeah, it's fun. I mean, let's have a bit of a laugh. It's the countryside. Now, you have to remember, we didn't see the countryside ever. We only ever saw concrete. if we ever left London, we would get really excited about seeing a cow or a sheep in a field. And that's not an exaggeration. So eventually I went for an interview. You had to have an interview after the exam, and I was offered a place. And I remember once I knew I was going, all of my friends on the estate would sort of talk about the schools they were going to around the corner, local schools. And I couldn't really take part in those conversations. I mean, I've got to tell you a story about my friends and how friendships would work on this day. My dad, although he'd left us many years before, was still kind of around. And he was, I have to say, he was the archetypal Italian ice cream man. And his round stopped outside our estate. So you would hear the chimes of the ice cream van, and all the kids in the estate would come rushing towards me. Obviously, find Mike. We've got to get Mike, because they thought they would get free ice creams. And that was really the most popular moment I would have in a week, was when Dad turned up. And they'd all come following me to the van, and I'd ask Dad, give us some this, he wants that, he wants that. Dad would never, ever give them what they wanted. He would give them a very simple cone. And I barely ever got the flake of chocolate in mine, but that was my dad. And so my friends, I think, were a bit sort of annoyed that they wouldn't be getting any free ice creams anymore. But I did suddenly start to feel very different, because I knew I was going somewhere different, and where it was incredibly high expectations. But of course, I didn't really think about that too much at the time. So eventually, at the age of 11, my time, I mean, I think Serge was a bit worried. He knew I could be a bit of a pain. So I think he was a bit worried about the chaos I might bring to his school that he'd managed to find his place in. But I wasn't too worried about that. And eventually, and if we can run that film of Fulham Court, I just want you to get this contrast. So this was where we grew up. This is all we knew. And I eventually got on a coach with 60 other new boys, and there's a 360 boy school, and drove the 75 miles, not happily, I have to say, at the time. And this was my new world. And I think we're going to bring up a picture of Wolverston. There it is. That, I went from that place you just saw to this place. This is a very important old house that the Inner London Education Authority had bought to set up the school. It's a very important building. Lord Berners owned it and built it. And I was in this great open countryside, and you can see the school from the air here. That was my new playground. And what you can see there in the background, the school's land went all the way to the river. And we had a sailing club. A sailing club? I didn't even know what sailing was. All that land, the fields to the right belonged to a farmer, but that didn't stop us ruining it and playing on it. That's the main building, and there were several buildings around it. And in front, the area you can't see, there was another huge load of land where we had our sports fields and all the rest of it. So this was my new home. And I had to, I mean, it was slightly easier for me because Serge was there. But suddenly, from this kind of rough street kid lifestyle, I was here with extraordinary amounts of, there's the back of the house, extraordinary amounts of rules and regulations. And that wasn't something, I mean, you know, rules and regulations were something I was kind of used to, but I never obeyed them. But that really wasn't the option here. There was a hierarchy, a very traditional kind of hierarchy. You had sixth formers and prefects. I was very resistant for a while. I soon worked out that it was sensible to do it. But you had to polish your shoes. You had to use certain doors. You couldn't walk on the grass. You had chores to do. You had to put your shoes into a shelf in a certain way. You had to sort of do your own laundry, change your beds, make your beds, change your beds. There were just hundreds and hundreds of what felt like petty and silly rules. And a lot of us took a while to get used to it. But one thing was for sure, it was an amazing place. I would wake up to the smells of the countryside and the sounds of the countryside, not trains and police sirens. It was very, very dark at night. There was so many treacherous things for us to kill ourselves with, frankly, in the woods, by the river, on the foreshore, where there was very sticky, sort of almost like quick mud. There were irrigation ponds that were deadly deep, and we really were just sort of left to it. The school was not didn't cosset us in any way. And that's one thing, the kind of structure. And of course it had corporal punishment, which I wasn't mad keen to get whacked, but I soon learned, as we did all of us, that there was a price to pay for every misdemeanor you committed. And you knew what the price was. It would be 3 or 4 or 5 whacks with a very thick rubber sole, plimp sole, or a cane. And you thought, well, actually, that misdemeanor will be a lot of fun. And actually, if I get caught, it's worth the 3 or 4 whacks. So it was a pretty good system, we thought. I mean, a lot of people think it's horrific, but at the time, we sort of saw it for what it was, which was a deal between us and the school and the masters. But the key thing about Wolverston wasn't just that it was in this incredible place. It was because it had very, very high demands of us. It normalized classical liberal education. From the very first day, we were studying things like Chaucer in Middle English, and we were doing very distinguished authors and writers, and educationally there was no. It pushed us to our limits, and it was perfectly normal that it did that. So that was one of its key principal aims. The other key principal thing that Wolverston was amazingly good at was sport and rugby, and that was a real place for kids to shine. Wolverston was one of the top 3 schools in the country for rugby regularly. And of course, we turned that into an enormous, and there I am in my first year outside the squash court. A squash court was another completely mysterious thing to me at the time. But rugby was the big shining tower that we all wanted to be able to sing from. And I loved it. Everybody worked really hard in it. It was incredibly professional, really. And that was something that we eventually sort of turned into a bit of a class war, because we would play really quite famous and distinguished public, i.e. private schools full of wealthy kids at rugby, big schools like places called Gresham's and Wyndham College and all sorts of places. And we were scum in their eyes, really. So not only would we end up thrashing them in the rugby because we were so much better than them at it, but often they would sort of take an opportunity to try and impose their social superiority upon us and not realize quite how feral and frankly violent kids like us could be when we were challenged in that way. So they'd lose twice in a day, and it was a real thing of honor that we would beat these incredibly wealthy and famous schools. But that filled us all with an enormous kind of sense of self-belief, which is something that kids from our background don't always have. So that was a very, very clever part of what Wolverston did. And the third pillar of Wolverston's brilliance really was its culture. We performed extraordinary pieces of music, London kids singing, Latin hymns and doing Handel and playing in orchestras, really was an extraordinarily unusual thing for us to do. But it was normalized, and it was fabulous on drama. It was one of the few things I was very good at. So these were 3 pillars that ran right through our lives at Wolverston. Now, my life at Wolverston started off, quite well. Couple of years, I did very well academically. I enjoyed it. But I think by my third year, when I was 13, the hormones were starting to kick in a bit. And goodness knows what else from our past and my lack of a dad, who knows. But I was beginning to get a little bit self-determinative. I would decide what I would do. I would tell you what was the right thing for me. And I was becoming a bit of a problem child. I wasn't malicious or terrible, but I could throw my weight around, that's for sure. And but we had a headmaster at the time. His name was Paddy Richardson, and I later found out he had a broken family, but he was very, very clever when it came to me, because he kind of worked me out, really, and he realized that I needed to have my righteous rants when I got into trouble, and then he'd point out that actually the teacher had the right to do what he did, and I had to get on with it. And I kind of trusted him, and that was an important thing, because when you're certain kids of a certain upbringing, a certain nature, you don't really trust adults. You think adults are going to sort of let you down. So eventually you just sort of make it that they will let you down, because they will anyway. But with Paddy, I didn't do that. But in my third form, and there's Paddy, I'm sitting on the floor in the middle of that picture. There I am on the left, and Paddy's got his hands on his knees. So I was very fond of Paddy. But in my third form, a terrible thing happened. He was killed in a car crash. And I remember the day when the gentleman sitting next to him with the beard on his right and left of him, as you look at it, David Hudson, there he is there in the white jacket to the left to the Paddy's right. He came into assembly one day, and it was a surprise, where's Paddy? And simply straight out said, Patrick Richardson was killed in a car crash last night. And it was an enormous bolt of, I can't really describe it, energy that shot through that room. And I remember me and my friend Rob, and he's still my best friend today, we went to the back of Paddy's house. We stole some flowers from some flower beds, and we took them to the back door of his house that was in the main building. We could hear his children still crying, and his wife, Jill, took the flowers from us, and we said we're very sorry, and we walked off. I was devastated, I think, by Paddy's death, because he was a sort of a beacon that I could sort of tie my rope to, I think. And so after that, whilst I continued to excel in certain things like rugby and certain subjects, I really became quite a truculent, obstreperous young man. I started to threaten people and teachers, and I started to get suspended. And it started to feel like Wolverston was just a bit chaotic for me. Eventually I saw it all out. I took from Wolverston what I enjoyed. I did school plays. I was always the lead in plays. That was my one talent, I think, that they felt I should pursue. I didn't want to. They wanted me to go to RADA, and I left. I said no. And at the age of 16, I mean, this was Wolverston. I mean, I've rushed through Wolverston, and hopefully you'll read the book where I tell a lot more about my tales at the school. But Wolverston was really filling me with things, and I wasn't really aware that it was filling me with things. And so I left, really, at 16. I didn't stay on. A cocksure, very sort of confident young man, but a bit misguided and a bit deluded. I hadn't really made connections. I was still, I think, the kid from Fulham. And so I went back to Fulham thinking I'm going to do this, be an amazing something or other, make lots of money and be famous. And I ended up doing several things. And at about the age of 19, I remember I was on a bagging plant for sand and ballast, and I was carrying about 25 tons of weight on my shoulder every day to stack pallets, and it was soaking wet and it was muddy. And I remember sitting in a yard, in a hut in the yard at this, it was the builders merchants, and the old foreman knew my background, knew the school I'd gone to, And he said something to me that really struck a chord. And he said, "I bet you never thought you'd end up doing this." And I thought to myself at the time, I really didn't. And I really, really need to be doing more than this, because I was given an opportunity that only 60 boys in the whole of London a year were given. And I was chucking it away because I wasn't allowing myself to let what Wolverstone put into me come out again. But I'd noticed how I would be able to talk a bit about Mozart or a particular author or all the things that I was taught at Wolverstone. And none of the people I was working with could. And it always felt a bit weird. And I always felt a bit out of place. Not that I was better than these people. It's just that I was given a better opportunity than those people. So at about the age of 19, I decided to change that. And I went and did various jobs in newspapers. And I read and read and read and read and read. And I'd always listened to music. I'd never stopped listening to music. And I always had sort of opera highlight CDs and things. And I used to go to the odd opera. I remember I used to think it would impress the girls if I took them to see an opera. It didn't always, but it was worth the try. So eventually I did a few jobs and I ended up at the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And I'm going to talk about that process from arriving at the Royal Borough of Kensington, which is a local authority, to where Opera Holland Park is today, because it began really the process 31 years ago. But after Wolverstone, so that was what created in me, I think, the ability to go into an environment like opera and theatre and insist that I belonged there. And so after Wolverstone was a kind of it was a weird hiatus. Now I wanted to talk really a bit about why, and I'm going to talk about it next week, and I hope you'll join us next week. So I wrote the book about Wolverstone. People have asked why I wrote the book. It began as someone had said on an old boys website that no one had ever written about being at Wolverstone. And there were some very, very famous people at Wolverstone. You may say Ian McEwan, the author, was taught by the same English teacher as I was. There are lots of famous sportsmen and musicians, incredible record of producing extraordinary people. The school was extraordinary. It is now closed. I'm happy it's another school. It's still a school, but it's Ipswich High School for girls, which is a great irony given the efforts we spent to get girls in when we were there. But it's a wonderful school, and they respect its history, and they invite us back from time to time, and we often go back. I'm still friends with many of the masters at the school, and that's an extraordinary thing 40 years later. And I think that says a lot for the power and influence it had on us. But socially, it created opportunities for boys that really, really wouldn't have been there. And I decided to write the story about Wolverstone in a sort of an essay, and I did. I started, and I thought, I can't really explain what an extraordinary place Wolverstone was, unless I explain the material it had to work with, which is boys like me and what our backgrounds were. So I began to write about my early life to put that into context. And of course, one thing led to another. I had some report books so I could refer to particular points in history. I never kept a diary. And eventually I thought, this is probably a book. And I fiddled with it for a long time, until about 6 years ago, when within the space of 18 months, Matt, who had gone on to be a full-blown heroin addict, was always in prison. I must have seen the inside of every prison in the southern half of the UK going to visit him. He was a good person, but he was very, very troubled. And in 18 months, my mother and my father all died within 18 months of each other. And it seemed to me that the book, as it was evolving, is really about Mum and was really about Matt and about my dad. It was really that those three kind of exemplified or symbolized if you like, the dysfunction of our family. And so I finished the book really because of them. And the book ends with the eulogies I did at Mum and Matt's funerals. And Wolverston was something that really did underpin the fact that I am doing now what I am doing in this extraordinary world. One, I'm leaving soon. I'm retiring at the end of this September. I've had 31 years, and it's time for me to try other things and let others carry Opera on Park forward. But, you know, it's an extraordinary world, the one that we live in and we work in. And it was really Wolverston that did that for me, that made it possible. Took a while for it to percolate through and for me to do something about it. But it really was responsible for everything, I think, that I am. And we don't have enough of that in this country now. I don't want to make a big political speech here, but our cultural education is ever more decreasing and diminishing. Obviously, culture now in the UK is in big difficulties because of the COVID crisis, but there isn't enough love for it in our schools, and how vital. And you will see on, I think on Viking's website, we make films about the way people who don't really engage with culture can suddenly learn to absolutely love it. And I think if you look on the Viking.TV site, you'll see under cultural partners and Opera on Park, you'll see 3 of the films we made about that, and we'll show you some clips and talk about them next week. But we believe that culture is more than just an embellishment. It is core to everything. And the book, if it's about anything, it is about that. And there are a few passages that I think would sort of qualify as essays or polemics on the subject. And that's in not too bad, 45, 42 minutes, I've managed to encompass the first 25 years of my life. I'd love you to read the book because it obviously it's all in there. There it is. Look at that, noisy at the wrong times. I'd like to tell you a couple of stories just to sort of, before we go to questions, and I hope you've all got some questions coming in. This book, obviously, once it was published, was read by a lot of people who went to Wolverston, knew me at Wolverston, were ex-masters of Wolverston. And there was a couple of stories that really told me a huge amount about what Wolverston was and how important it was. And I sometimes get quite emotional when I talk about these things. But I remember there was one evening at the opera. I hadn't been in, unusually, I hadn't been in one evening for one reason or another. And so I'd missed a person who was there who wanted to speak to me. I went in the next evening and one of our front of house staff handed me a note. And I immediately recognized the handwriting. And it was from Jill Richardson, Paddy Richardson's wife. Now, this is 35 years after I last saw her, and she, because they'd left the school when he died, they had to move out, really. And she said, "I've seen your name in the program and I wanted to come and say hello." And she left the phone number and I rang her up and I found myself getting really emotional talking to her because I was remembering the day. And I said, "I'm really amazed, Jill, that you even remember me. You know, it was so long ago." She says, "Mike, you came to my back door with flowers. How could I forget that?" And I went to see her after that, and we've become friends. And her daughter, Lucy, or I remember when she was a young teenager when we were there. She's now a very successful theatre director and theatre arts manager. And there was one other story, which I think probably sums it all up. An old patron of ours came to me and said, "I wanted to talk to you for 2 years and I haven't been able to." And I asked him why. And he said, "Well, you've published your book now and I've read it and I realized that you admit what a little sod you were." And I said, "Okay, so what is it you want to ask me?" And he said, "Well, I'm a governor of a school and our headmaster is about to retire. And a story I hadn't told you is I threatened to throw a teacher out of a window. And he said he used to teach you at Wolverston." And I said, "Oh, what was his name?" And he told me his name. And I said, did he mention that he and I didn't get on very well? And he said, yes, he did. He told me that. I said, and did he mention that I threatened to throw him out of a window? And he said, yeah, he mentioned that. But he wanted me to tell you something. He wanted me to tell you that you were right and he was wrong. And what had happened is that he'd got quite physical with me, which was bringing himself down to my level, which elicited a particularly expressive response from me. And he said he learned an awful lot from that day, and he never got to say so. And he wanted me to tell you that. And after 30 years of teachers, I thought, yes, I was right. I knew I was right. But funny enough, I met him a few months ago at a reunion, and we had a good chat. But he went on to be a headmaster of a very distinguished school. And I like to think that in my kind of youthful truculence, I helped him become a better teacher, to have that great career. And I think with that, I am going to ask if you have any questions, which I'd be very happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Yes, Michael, lots of questions have come in. So
fire away.
First question comes in from John in London, and he says, hi, Michael. Love what you've done with Holland Park. I've been numerous times. What are your plans once you leave later this year?
Well, my plans were rather thrown into disarray by COVID. I sort of didn't have any plans, John. I decided that I was going to find something that really appealed to me, something that, you know, I could just focus on, and perhaps in the area of social development. I'm very keen on that, you know, youth development, social development. I'm very keen on mental health. So I'm looking for all sorts of opportunities. I may end up back in the arts again. I was hoping to know a bit more about that by now. But of course, COVID in March shut down the entire job market. So I'm having various conversations. I've had various conversations. Some things haven't been quite right. Some things not quite. They want me to move somewhere. So I don't yet know, John. If you've got a job, please give me a call. Viking will provide details if you need to offer me anything. But thanks for the question, and thanks for your interest.
Next question is from Jane in London. Do you enjoy any other music apart from opera?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Oh, yes. You should look at my Twitter feed today, Jane. It's a whole tweet about my favourite drummers. No, I'm very, very much into, I mean, I love opera, but my great love, I suppose, is jazz and soul and funk and those sorts of music. I also am a mad fan of people like John Martin and XTC and African music. I'm a big fan of. I'm a big fan of sort of fusion music. So at the moment, I've been talking and listening a lot to people like Nitin Sawhney. No, I've got just about the widest musical taste. I actually don't listen to opera a lot, to be fair. I you know, it's on, and I now and again I'll listen to bits and pieces, or if we're thinking about repertoire, you listen to it then. But no, my great pleasures, my great joys are wide and varied. Absolutely. Thanks for your question, Jane.
Next question is from Olaf in Los Angeles, and he would like to know, isn't there a song about Wolverston School?
Wow. I don't know. I'd love to hear it, Olaf. If you can send a link or find me on Twitter and link me to it. I know there are some quite well-known bands, obviously friends of mine. I mean, back in the day, he was a big star in the UK, but Curiosity Killed the Cat, Modern English, the band, the New Wave band, were Wolverstonites. A couple of them were. But I don't know of a song about Wolverston. I'd be fascinated to hear it if anyone's got a hint or a tip. Any Wolverston boys listening, do you know about it? Please let me know. I'd love to hear it.
Next question is from Hazel in Tadworth. If you hadn't found opera, what would be your profession?
Oh, well, let's say if I hadn't had Wolverston, I'd probably be in jail. What would be my profession? I think a travel writer, probably. Yes, I think so. Was that Jane, did you say? Yes, Jane, I think it would be. Kelly, sorry. I think it would be probably a travel writer. I had ambitions to be a travel writer at one point, and I did some of that in one of my pre-opera jobs. I was doing press trips to all sorts of places, which was fun. But I soon got sick of that. But I think that would probably be what I would do. Or I would be a carpenter. I've always said I'd love to be a carpenter. I just never had the application to do it.
Next question comes in from Nick in Norfolk, and he would like to know, who would you most like to have seen perform, alive or dead?
In opera, I think probably Di Stefano. Who would I like to have seen in any other realm of music? Donny Hathaway. I think he's got the greatest soul voice of all time, and I'd love to have seen him live. I saw virtually everyone else I wanted to see, but Donny Hathaway, yes, for me, that would be the one.
Okay, next question is from Fee in Fort William in Scotland.
Near where my brother lives.
She says, thank you for your talk. Your life story is so interesting. Are you planning to write any more books?
Yes, I kind of am at the moment, although I'm not sure if I'm going to finish it. It's a sort of, I'm scoping it out. I think the thing with the book was that I had something to say, really. That was my key thing. I had a story to tell and I had something to say. I don't feel I'm a novelist or ever could be. I mean, I know everyone thinks there's a novel in everyone, but I'm not one of them. There is a book that I'm writing and sort of playing with and sort of thinking about, researching, which is really about being an Italian in Britain, really, and how it feels and how it's always felt weird, but how it feels even more weird nowadays with everything that's going on with Brexit and things. I have an Italian passport and I'm an Italian citizen as well as a British citizen, but it's become a very strange place for people like me. And I think there's a lot to say about that. There's a lot to say about the cultural element of being a sort of an in-betweenie. I'm a kind of an in-betweenie. I don't really feel at home in the UK, but I don't really want to live in Italy. It's a strange thing. So there's perhaps something in that, but it takes a lot of time and application, and I'm not terribly applied, really. But I think I'd love to, but I need to be sure that it's not boring and ridiculous and no one wants to read it.
Penny from Epsom, she asks, aside from Opera Holland Park, what's your favourite place to watch opera, or the most spectacular places you've seen it anywhere in the world?
I suppose that would have to be places like Verona, really, because it's so mad and crazy and just insane, it's just insane. And it was also wonderful to go to the Met in New York to see a friend of ours, someone who had sort of emerged through Opera Holland Park, was playing a lead role at the Met, which is sort of an amazing pinnacle. So it was fabulous to go and see it there at this kind of huge, also quite preposterous temple of opera. I think the thing about opera is we do associate it with grandiosity. We associate it with big, when they did Aida in front of the pyramids, and opera lends itself to that because of its stories, and of course, directors and designers, if they're given the money, will make sure they spend it and create these enormous things. But I think actually, I think some of the most spectacular, unbelievably powerful evenings of opera that I've had, of any theatre I've had, I mean, we used to do some theatre at Opera Holland Park years ago, is at Opera Holland Park and places that are small. You see things in pubs, and it's the visceral nature of opera that affects you. Sometimes, big grand things can seem a bit distant, but when you see it in mid-size with really brilliantly done things, and productions, it overwhelms you much more quickly, I think. So whilst you can talk about these spectacular sort of showy places to do it, I would always recommend people got down and dirty with opera and get to the nitty gritty, because it's a very physical art form, both in doing it and in receiving it. Hope that answers your question.
The next question comes in from David from Missouri, and he says, in the US, we have seen a continual pressure on universities in particular to pursue more technical and scientific curricula at the expense of the cultural education. How would you argue for continuing to promote literary and artistic programs? And he says, I know you discussed this in your book.
Yeah, David is absolutely right, and it's a big thing in the UK. This government, particularly at the moment, is obsessed with STEM subjects, and which are important. I mean, let's not pretend they're not important. But, you know, culture and arts are getting shifted down the importance ladder. The simple fact is this. I think 100 scientists who are utterly obsessed with opera. I know for a fact that any young person who studies literature, who studies music, understands art, immerses themselves in it, doesn't mean they have to go and be an artist or a singer or a musician or whatever, but they should study it. They should experience it. They should live it, because it's what generates an enormous amount of our emotional maturity, is the understanding of stories depicted and experiencing and feeling them. And anybody I defy to tell me that a well-experienced, cultured, someone who's able to get in touch with their kind of emotional side, and I urge you to go and see one of our films called Into the Light, which was with some soldiers who have PTSD, and it's on the Viking website. That is a critical. It's entirely fundamental to what we are as a species. Entirely. Think about it. All you do is watch TV, listen to music. I mean, it's incredible. And I think it makes for better scientists, and I think it makes for better lawyers and accountants and architects, because they have an enrichment that creates more of a depth to them as empathetic beings, and understands aesthetics. I mean, it's almost ridiculous to even have to suggest it. But it is a battle, David. You're right that we have to continue to fight, and we will. You know, we'll do what we can. All the opera companies and arts companies in the UK have huge education programs, but we can only make a small dent. It needs to be systemic from the very beginning of education.
Great. Next question is from Aaron in London. He says, hi, Michael. This is Aaron Hanson's house, 1977 to 82. Thank you for sharing your story. Like you, coming from Shepherd's Bush and a troubled family life, I agree that the core values installed into us by the masters and school have kept me going. The part you said when you couldn't fit in with others because you have something different.
Yeah.
I've purchased your book. My question, do you pass on any of the old masters' words or teaching ways onto the others at work or at home?
That's a really good. Hi, Aaron. I think I remember an Aaron. That you were there. You were slightly lower than me, weren't you? The year below. I'm sorry if I bullied you, but I probably didn't. I'm only joking. But do I pass it on? That's a really good question. I learned an awful lot from certain teachers. I think I learned, and I do pass this on to some staff and people, but I think I learned from Paddy mostly, and you'll probably remember the day, Aaron, when he died, but I think I learned to fight the battles you can win. That was a key, and I think I do say that a lot to staff. You know, when they get very frustrated about certain things, you say, okay, we'll take a step back down and let's just go at it from another angle and we'll win the war, but I think that was a key thing. But no, I don't suppose anything directly. They all stick so vividly in my mind, some of them, the great masters. You'll remember them, Aaron, Pete Sadler and Neil Clayton and Doc Thornbury and Tony Watkins, these remarkable, huge Shake Shaft. These were remarkable, huge personalities as well as intellects. They were emblazoned. They were all emblazoned on our. And one story I remember that our art teacher, Mrs. Norman, I got a note from someone said, "My mother used to teach you at Wolverstone. I'm in at the theatre. I'll pop round and see you." And I remember I saw from 100 yards away, and I knew that it was Mrs. Norman's daughter. It's remarkable. So I think that whilst I don't sort of, I don't preach exact Thornbury ease or Claytonese. I think there's an awful lot of what those masters, the really good ones, John Morris, etc., kind of taught me. I think primarily they taught me how not to be. So when I'm kind of when I'm tempted with that sort of red mist, I often think of some of them, and that kind of pulls me back, But great to hear from you, Aaron.
Next question comes in from Mac in London.
Mac,
M-A-C, okay. From London. Actually, Not a question, just a comment. He just wanted to say, hi to Mike, and it was a pleasure to be part of Into the Light. All the best,
that's Mac.
Your favourite metalhead.
Yeah, good old Mac. Yeah, Mac, Ian and Tina. Yeah, thanks, Mac, for watching. Yeah, Mac was brilliant in it. The film, it's on the Viking site. Please watch it. It's very touching. These guys have all got stories to tell, and I'll let them tell it in the film. But they really opened themselves to an experience of opera that they didn't have to do it. And Mac is like he says, he's a metalhead, and he was brilliant in allowing it to affect him. It gave him a real lot to think about. So you should watch that film. It's very touching, and good on you, Mac. I've watched you train, Mac. Mac does a lot of powerlifting, so I've watched you train on your Instagram. So keep up the hard work.
Scott from Grapevine, just another comment. He said, I lived in East Anglia in the 1950s. Your talk brings back such memories. So thank you.
Yeah, well, Suffolk, the county that Wolverstone is very, very beautiful. It's quite flat, but it's very evocative. It's on the east of the country, so it gets a bit of a cold wind from time to time. But it is very characterful and a beautiful part of the world, actually, it's Suffolk. And particularly that particular part, that peninsula that Wolverstone sits on the east. Yeah. Thank you.
Next question is from Susan in Austin. She says, thank you for sharing your story. I'm wondering if you discovered that you are a musical person. Do you play any instruments or do you sing?
Yeah, at Wolverstone, I played instruments and I sang all the way through my career at school. Not so much after, but it was constant. I play music. I create music. I play a couple of things. Drums was something I took up when I left school, but I make music. I'm moderately musical, and I love to make it. I love to, express how you feel through music. It's a real joy, and it takes a lot. One thing that it's good at when you're making music is you're so totally immersed in it. You think about nothing else, and that is a little holiday for the mind sometimes. So yes, I do, and Wolverstone really encouraged musicality and singing when we were there. It was a big part of the whole principle of the place. Thank you for your question.
So, Michael, this is your last question of the evening, and it comes in from Art from Arizona. So he's asked, do you sing much opera? If so, what is your vocal range?
Me? No, I don't sing opera. I sing a couple of times a year at various things. When I was about 16 and my voice had broken, I was able to go from second tenor in the choir down to second bass, which was a pretty good range, I thought. Nowadays, I'd probably put it most comfortably in the kind of bass baritone range, I would say, is where my fach is, as they say. But you do find yourself when you may be singing in an event where there's a choir or hymns or whatever it might be, you find yourself sort of singing a bit higher than you should, because it sort of feels more natural to sing a bit higher. But then you realize your voice doesn't agree with you, and so you find yourself descending again back to the bass baritone, or at best baritone part of the voice. But I do, one thing I might do, in answer to that question earlier about what I would do, one thing I might do is I might start singing more regularly with a choir somewhere. I think that's something I'd possibly like to do. Thank you. Are you there?
Yeah, no, that's your last question of the evening. Thank you.
Right. Well, listen, I'm glad to have done it and hopefully sounded coherent. It was pretty much about what you leave out as well as what you put in doing this. I'm really excited that next week I'll be able to talk to you about the evolution of Opera Holland Park. And I think what we'll have there is a lot more examples of some of the music that we've become very well known for, and really the amazing story of what we tried to set up, hoped it would be, and what it did actually achieve and become. We sort of made our ambition, and Opera Holland Park really fills a very unusual and important role in the opera ecology in this country. So I'm excited to talk to you next week. I'm really, really grateful that you all listened and sent so many questions. That was really nice of you. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And please do, you can get the book on Noisy at the Wrong Times. You can get it on Amazon. It's on Kindle. There's even a audio book, which I did the reading for. And you get to hear the voice of my mother, who's a very big character in this book, a huge character in this book. And when I say her voice, it's me doing her voice, but I can assure you it's a very accurate impersonation. So thank you very much for tuning in. I'm very, very flattered and honored. And I will hopefully see you all next week at same time, same place. Thank you.